Most people who hear the phrase corporate personhood for the first time scratch their heads, look at you funny, and maybe wonder what you've been smoking. The absurdity of corporate personhood has that effect on people. It just doesn't make sense. But corporate personhood is not only real under the law, it has an enormous impact on all of us. It's to our best interest that we know what it is, how it got here, and why we need to get rid of it. To understand the crux of the problem, we have to go back to the construction of our Constitution. This document was written by 55 oligarchs who were aware that their power depended on how much property they owned: land, crops, buildings, personal goods, and, for most of them, their slaves. As some of the best educated men in the world, by European standards anyway, they also knew about democracy, and they understood what a threat the real thing represented to their personal power. The kind of democracy they prized and wrote about so eloquently could only be practiced by people like them, certainly not by the rabble, or as Alexander Hamilton so fondly referred to us, the mob at the gate. So, in the Constitution they created a republic and a system of government that is designed to protect property, not people. And not surprisingly, when folks in the United States got their first look at the proposed Constitution, they howled. At least half of the population was very much opposed to the Constitution. They had just fought a long, bloody revolution driven by the words liberty and freedom, not President or Congress or Supreme Court. But the Federalists who proposed the Constitution had the clout to promote their ideas strongly, and after a lot of politicking, they got the Constitution ratified, but only with the assurance that a Bill of Rights would be added to protect people from the excesses by the government that would be possible under the new system. It's worth noting that nowhere in the Constitution does the word democracy appear, nor the word corporation, nor slave, but we'll come back to these in a minute. First, let's look at the basic structure they're created to protect property. We start with the sacred words, "We the people of the United States," who are sovereign and have individual rights, and then we have a government to serve those people that is accountable and has specific duties. The people delegate some of their power to the government in order to perform its specific duties. In a representative democracy, this system should work just fine. There's just one little problem. It's that word people. At the time the Constitution was ratified, in order to be considered one of we the people, you had to be an adult male, you had to be white, and you had to have a certain amount of property. At the time of the Constitution, this narrowed we the people down to about 10% of the population, where it still is today. Those who owned property, including human property, were very clear that this was rule by the minority, and that's the way they wanted it. Now, I mentioned earlier that the word corporation appears nowhere in the Constitution, and the reason is that the Founding Fathers had zero interest in using them to run their new government. In colonial times, corporations had been chartered by the king for the purpose of exploiting the so-called New World and shoveling wealth back into Europe. Corporations like the Hudson Bay Company and the British East India Company and the Massachusetts Bay Colony had a lot of autonomy to do this work. They could pass laws, levy taxes, and even raise armies to manage and control property and commerce. They were not popular with the colonists. So when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, they threw control of the corporations to state legislatures, where they would get the closest supervision by the people. Early corporate charters were very explicit about what a corporation could do, how, for how long, with whom, where, and when. Individual stockholders were held personally liable for any harm done in the name of the corporation, and most charters only lasted 10 to 15 years. But most importantly, In order to receive the profit-making privileges they sought, corporations had to represent a clear benefit for the public good. And when corporations violated any of these terms, their charters were frequently revoked by the state legislatures. Well, as time passed and memories of royal oppression faded, the wealthy folks increasingly started eyeing corporations as a convenient way to shield their personal fortunes. They could see that their minority rule through property was under serious threat of being diluted. By 1848, upper-class women had started publicly agitating for the right to vote. During and after the Civil War, there was a rapid increase in the number and size of corporations, and this form of business was starting to become a more important way of holding and protecting property and power. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, freeing the slaves. Change was afoot, and so the ruling class responded. Increasingly through their corporations, the ruling class started influencing legislators, bribing public officials, and employing lawyers to write new laws and file court cases challenging the existing laws that restricted corporate behavior. Bit by bit, state legislatures increased corporate charter length while they decreased corporate liability and citizen authority over corporate structure, governance, production, and labor. But they were only going to be able to go just so far with this strategy. Because corporations are a creation of the government, chartered by the state legislatures, they still fell on this side of the line, with duties accountable to the people. If minority rule by property was going to be accomplished through corporations, they had to cross this line and become entitled to rights instead. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, giving citizenship rights to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, the intended beneficiaries being the newly freed slaves. From then it took the ruling class less than 20 years to shift corporations from the duty side to the right side, which they managed to do at a time when all women, all Native Americans, and even most African American men were still denied the right to vote. After a series of lower court cases, the watershed moment came in 1886 when the U.S. Supreme Court heard a case called Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. The case not once mentioned the rights of corporations under the 14th Amendment, but the court reporter J.C. Bancroft Davis, who at one time was the president of the Newburgh and the New York Railway, took it upon himself to add in the statement of facts and headnotes that the court was of the opinion that corporations had the same rights as people. There was no public debate about this and no law passed in Congress. Corporations received the status of persons by trickery through judicial fiat. Unfortunately, the legal status of headnotes and statement of facts were not decided until 1905, when the court ruled in United States versus Detroit Lumber Company that headnotes and statement of facts are not part of the court's decision. Irregardless of this decision, the court did not rescind the personhood precedent derived from the headnotes and statement of facts of Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, and corporations continued to acquire the same Bill of Rights as living, breathing human beings. 10 years later, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court established a separate but equal doctrine that legalized racial segregation through what became known as Jim Crow laws. In less than 30 years, African Americans had effectively lost their legal personhood rights, while corporations had acquired them. And in case you're still wondering whether the primary purpose of the Constitution and the body of law it spawned is about protecting property rather than people, listen to this. Of the 14th Amendment cases heard in the Supreme Court in the first 50 years after its adoption, less than 0.5% invoked it in protection of African Americans, and more than 50% ask that its benefits be extended to corporations. When you look at 2+ centuries of U.S. legal history, the pattern is that people acquire rights by amendment to the Constitution, a long, drawn-out, difficult process, and corporations acquire them by Supreme Court decisions. Rights for corporations, because they're about property, is about who is excluded. Rights for human beings is about who is included. Once corporations had jumped the line, they proceeded to pursue the Bill of Rights through more Supreme Court cases. In 1893, they were assured Fifth Amendment protection of due process. In 1906, they got Fourth Amendment search and seizure protection. In 1925, it was freedom of the press and speech. In 1976, the Supreme Court determined that money is equal to speech, and since corporate persons have First Amendment rights, they basically contribute as much money as they want to political parties and candidates. As if the ruling elite didn't have enough influence in the political process, the Supreme Court's January 2010 Citizens United versus FEC decision opened up the floodgates of money and influence that a corporation and even foreign corporations can contribute in an election. And so we find ourselves in a time when corporations have amassed enormous power and wealth and control nearly every aspect of our lives because they masquerade, under the law at least, as one of us. But most of us don't know it. A key reason for that is that the whole thing is pretty esoteric, and of course, the corporate-owned media is not going to tell us that a corporation is a legal fiction, an abstraction, if you will. You can't see or hear or touch or smell a corporation. It's just an idea that people agree to and put into writing. You can cut off the figurative arm or leg or even head of the corporate hydra, and it can still continue to exist. Furthermore, corporate lawyers invoke their personhood status, or not, at their convenience, allowing them to be whatever they want according to their needs. Along with this abstract existence, corporations have acquired a lot more abstract property. Ownership of land and buildings is still important, but now corporate property also includes concepts like mineral rights, drilling rights, air pollution credits, intellectual property, and under NAFTA, the rights to future profits. Some even own the patent of life, as in genetically modified organisms, commonly referred to as GMOs. All this abstraction fits into the ways property is used to maintain minority rule. When corporations were over on the duty side of the line, the primary technique for enforcing minority rule was to establish that only a tiny percent would qualify as we the people. In other words, that most people were subhuman. As different groups of people struggled to be included in those first 3 words of the Constitution and eventually succeeded, the corporation crossed over to the right side and ultimately became superhuman. The same 10% have over 90% of the wealth. In the last 3 decades, the corporations and their lapdog politicians have taken the system globally. Having acquired the ability to govern in the United States, the corporation is the ideal instrument to gain control of the rest of the world. The concepts, laws, and techniques perfected by the ruling minority here are now being forced down the throats of people everywhere. First, the complicit ruling elite is co-opted, installed, or propped up by the U.S. military and the government. Then, just as slavery and immigrant status once kept wages non-existent or at poverty levels, now sweatshops, maquiladoras, and the prison industrial complex provide ultra-cheap labor with little or no regulation. Just as sharecropping and company store script once kept people trapped in permanently subservient production roles, now the International Monetary Fund and World Banks conspire through structural adjustment programs, keep entire countries in permanent debt, the world's poorest people forced to feed interest payments to the world's richest while their own families go hungry. Just as genocide was waged against our own native populations that live sustainably on the land, now wars are instigated against peoples and regimes that resist the so-called free trade mantra because they have the audacity to hold their own ideas about governance and resource distribution. And finally, because of the way corporate personhood has enabled corporations to govern us, we see that it is so bad we must destroy it. The hardest part of eliminating corporate personhood is believing that we, the people, have the sovereign right to do this. It comes down to us being clear about who's in charge. What would change if corporations did not have personhood? Well, here are a few examples. If corporations no longer had the First Amendment right of free speech, we could prohibit all corporate political activity. No more contributions to candidates or parties, no more lobbying. Just think of the ripple effect on our political process if no more corporate money could contaminate it. Corporations are now protected against search without a warrant under the Fourth Amendment. This means that OSHA and the EPA have to schedule their inspections at a time convenient to corporate managers. If you think the air, land, or water in your community is being polluted, or the employees are working in an unsafe environment, neither you nor the government can go on corporate property to get information without legal permission. Just think of the consequences if corporate polluters were no longer shielded by the Constitution. We could leaflet in malls, we could pass laws against chain stores and cell phone towers, and we could organize openly at work. If corporate personhood is destroyed, a floodgate of possibilities opens for citizen sovereignty to replace corporate governance.